All right, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. There might be more people who will continue to join us, but because this session is being recorded, they'll be able to catch up later as well. So yeah, I'm going to now start officially. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today, and welcome to the KBA Reassessments webinar. My name is Samriddhi Rajal, and I'm the training officer for the KBA Secretariat, as many of you know by now. Let's start with a bit of housekeeping. So, as you're all aware, this webinar session is being recorded. So if you want to turn your videos off, and most of you have, yeah, please feel free to do that. We will be uploading the webinar recording on YouTube, and the link will be shared to all participants and all registrants in a follow-up email, probably within the week, so within the next 7 days. We do not actually have any specific breaks built in into the webinar, but since there are 3 specific topics that we are going over today, we will probably end up taking a couple of questions in between the topics. When you do have a question, please raise your hands and we will call on you at the end of each topic. If your microphone doesn't work or you just don't want to speak today, then you can post your comments or questions in the chat box as well, and we will get to it. At the end of the webinar, I will also be posting a link to the feedback form so that you can provide feedback on how you thought the session went. My only request is that you please let us know what we did right and what we could do better so that we can improve the quality of these sessions moving forward. Olivia will be leading today's session, and we will begin with a general overview of what KBAs are and the need for KBA reassessments to set up the context for the webinar. After this, we will focus specifically on what we mean by and how to actually deal with the 3 main topics under discussion today, which is codependent sites, superseding sites, and delisting sites. So with that, as you can see on the screen, we have 5 learning objectives for today. So by the end of this hour, you should basically be able to explain why KBA reassessments need to take place, outline the process of reassessing a site and or just one trigger element within the site, assess whether a site is codependent or not, articulate why a site might be or may be superseded, and then also finally discuss the reasons why a trigger element and or a site may be delisted. So before Olivia takes over, let me just very briefly introduce her. Many of you may already know, but Olivia is the Global Science Coordinator for IBAs and KBAs in BirdLife International, which is based in Cambridge, UK. She is also the co-chair of the KBA Technical Working Group. And as if that wasn't enough, she's also leading the development of the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, or WDKBA. She is a very busy person, and I am very grateful that she's made the time to lead this session. So with that being said, I'm now going to let Olivia take over for the rest of the session. And I'm going to mute myself.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Eddie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'll just start with a couple of introductory slides in relation to KBA reassessments themselves. So as you all know, KBAs are sites of importance for the global persistence of biodiversity, and these will only be recognised among the global community as such if they consistently meet the criteria. So at the moment, KBAs are serving many purposes globally, and this includes first and foremost safeguarding of sites. KBAs are being used to guide protection, protected area designation. They're also being used to guide where funding is needed. They're used for tracking SDGs and CBD targets. So decisions are being made all the time about KBAs, and money has been spent to avoid areas or minimize the impact at these sites. Because of their KBA status, a reassessment is really important to make sure that the quality of the information at the sites that are being identified as KBAs are up to scratch. Reassessments are also required to ensure that the most up-to-date information is available out there to the public. Reassessments are really important given ongoing changes in biodiversity globally. So sites are changing on a regular basis, as we know, especially for some trigger elements. And reassessments enhance the value of the data set across all of the KBA program objectives. So it's recommended that KBAs are reassessed every 8 to 12 years. If they're not reassessed within that 12-year period, they're flagged within the WDKBA as in need of update. Earlier reassessments, so before the 8 to 12-year period, are encouraged in certain circumstances, especially if new information becomes available about any of the biodiversity elements or the site itself. If the site, for example, is affected by a catastrophic event, if there are taxonomic changes in some of the trigger elements, or indeed if the threat status of trigger elements changes. Ideally, during a reassessment, especially if an NCG is in place, all elements should be reassessed. But we recognize that this is not always possible, and individual proposers may only be familiar with some of the trigger elements. So reassessment of all triggers is not compulsory. Proposers have the option of reassessing those biodiversity elements they're most familiar with. The most recent assessment date for a site will be based on the most recent reassessment of a trigger element. However, any trigger elements at a site that haven't been reassessed in that 8 to 12-year window will still be flagged as in need of reassessment. So some of the considerations during reassessment, as Izzy mentioned earlier, are codependent sites, superseding sites, and delisting trigger elements and sites. So I'm just going to go into each in detail, and at the end of each section, I'll pose for questions. So starting with codependent sites. So what are these? These are sites where reassessments really should be coordinated. They should take place simultaneously, because changes at one site or a reassessment at one site may also influence a reassessment at another site. So you may have, for example, in the top diagram there, overlapping sites. So in an overlapping situation like this, really resolution is required. There are many examples in the WDKBA at the moment of sites that are overlapping, and we're hoping that over time, as sites become reassessed, we'll be able to rationalize these overlaps, because ideally KBAs should not overlap. So in this example, we have a relatively large portion of one or other site that needs to be taken away from that site. So we need to move it into the red site or into the yellow site. So ideally, because there are relatively large portions of one or other site that's going to be affected, you would need to do a reassessment of both of these sites at the same time. Adjacent sites that have part of a boundary common to both, if there's going to be a change in one of those sites, then obviously that will mean a change to the other one, especially if that's the common boundary, and similarly, that's where reassessment of both sites would be needed. And note that there are some examples in WDKBA where the overlaps are really slight, and it's really due to delineation issues more than anything. It's not due to a genuine overlap, and these should be also reconciled during reassessments. So if you're an individual proposer with information only on one of the two sites, then you should consult the owner of the other boundary and seek a solution for that boundary reconciliation. There's another example that probably doesn't happen too often, but we have been aware of it actually happening, is where site names have been switched during the proposal process, and possibly due to a typo on the proposer.
Yeah.
Hello? I'll just keep going here. So that might be due to the proposers just making a mistake when they're completing the proposals initially, and this has been picked up. So yeah, and generally speaking, sites that are near to each other and where it's possible, they should be reassessed at the same time. Also, if you are changing the name of the site, you should mention this in the site details narrative. In some cases, it may be worth encapsulating the old site name within the new one. For example, if you have a lake, Lake A, and it's renamed to National Park Y, you could have National Park Y and in brackets including Lake A. So the recognition of the former name it continues. So how do we deal with codependent sites? So you can submit codependent site proposals and assessments at the same time. And as I say, you can mention the names of other codependent sites at the same time. And the ideal place to mention this is in the additional information text box, which is in the site details tab. And while you're doing so, also mention the type of codependency that we're talking about. So if there are any queries on codependent sites, happy to take those now. I can't see any hands, so Iddy, I'm going to rely on you for this one.
Yeah, sounds good. Don't think there's any hands up right now, and there's nothing in the chat box either.
Excuse me, I have a question. I am Carolina Fierro from Colombia. I have the case that you just show us in the picture, the red circle that it's like a 3 balloons and it's overlapping with a protected area that is also a KBA. We are not going to change the limits of the KBA that has that is overlapping completely with the protected area, but we are changing the limits of the other one. So in that case, it's still necessary to mention both sides, or I can just change the limits of the KBA that is strange, like the shape is weird, and just change the limit of that and do not mention the other one.
Hi, Carolina. If the other site is not affected by the change, you don't need to mention it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, that was all.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'll move on to the next section then, which is superseding sites. So what is superseding? So superseding essentially means replacing. It's where an existing site is replaced by another site or other sites. And this may be due to a few reasons. So just looking at each of these reasons in turn. So we may have a situation where 2 or more existing KBAs are merged to form a single KBA. So in that case, you will have, in this case, you'd have 3 KBAs being superseded and 1 new KBA being formed or created. Another example is where we have a single KBA and it may be split into 2 or more KBAs. So here we're creating 2 KBAs and we're superseding the other site. So by superseding it, basically it means that we're recognizing that the area is still KBA, but it belongs to another KBA essentially, or other KBAs. There are also other examples. One other example that's quite common is where you have a substantial change in delineation of the KBA. So in this example here, we might have site A and it's been extended such that the change is quite dramatic. You can see that more than 50% of the site has been added to it. And it probably reflects a change in the trigger elements. So there'll be a greater abundance of species or a greater extent of an ecosystem. So in this case, you really are changing the site. So you should really supersede the former site. So what the definition of substantial is, it really is up to the discretion of the proposer. You guys know the sites better and best and know best what to do. There may be situations where you have relatively large extensions, but they don't really make substantive differences to the trigger elements or the nature of the site. Alternatively, you may have relatively small extensions to the site that do make quite a big difference to the types of trigger elements that occur or to the site itself. So whether or not you supersede a site by extending it really is up to your discretion. And there's one other example that happens from time to time where you might have 2 or more KBAs becoming 2 or more other KBAs. So you might have just a redelineation of a bunch of KBAs in that case. So how do we supersede sites? So multiple sites being merged into one KBA. There is a superseded sites text box in the site details tab in the WDKBA. So here we would like mention of the 2 or more sites that are becoming superseded. At the end of the process, the KBA Secretariat will then go to those sites and will assign them superseded status. In an example where one KBA is split into multiple KBAs, for each of the new KBAs that you create, please mention the superseded site in the superseded site text box. And where there's a substantial change in delineation, again, mention the site that you're superseding in that box. And in the KBA whose boundary has been changed, and as I said, the KBA Secretariat will assign superseded status to anything that's been superseded at the end of the process. So that's superseded sites. I'll take any questions you may have.
There are no comments or questions in the chat box. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I shall move on to the last main section, which is delisting sites. So a site should be delisted when during reassessment the biodiversity elements, all of the biodiversity elements, fail to meet the KBA criteria anymore. So this is really important to maintain the integrity of the KBA and also to maintain the reputation of the sites, because really we are lucky to be able to stand over our KBAs. They're backed in general by good scientific evidence. In terms of the workflow, from a proposer perspective to go about delisting, you first of all need to undertake a reassessment at the site. Where available, provide updated estimates of the biodiversity elements. For any biodiversity element that no longer qualifies, provide a reason. If none of the trigger elements then meet the criteria anymore, then the site no longer qualifies as a global KBA, and the site will be delisted by the KBA Secretariat at the end of the process. Delisted sites remain in the WDKBA because it's important that they are there, because they may once again become important in the future and they may need to be reassessed. But the delisted sites will no longer appear on public-facing sites such as the KBA website, the fact sheets, and so on. The reasons why a site might be why a species or ecosystem may be delisted. First of all, there may be improved information. We may have a change in the criteria revision. There may be changes to the status of the qualifying triggers. There may be a genuine decline in the triggers, or there may be a genuine change for other factors, for other reasons. So just going through each one in turn. First of all, in terms of improved information, this may be where you have better information becoming available about a species or ecosystem's distribution, perhaps based on more robust evidence. For example, first survey of species X or ecosystem Y in country Z took place. And all of a sudden, we have really good information. And unfortunately, we can now show that that biodiversity element that used to meet the criteria, or so we thought, doesn't meet the criteria anymore. In terms of KBA criteria revision, so a trigger that qualified under one or more previous criteria, for example, the legacy KBA criteria, so the old Langhammer criteria, for example, they don't meet the criteria anymore when tested or assessed against the current KBA standard. When it comes to changes in the status of the qualifying triggers, this could be for several reasons. Firstly, the original taxonomy of the trigger element is no longer recognized. So the species or ecosystem is no longer a potential KBA trigger element. This can also happen when the category of extinction risk on the IUCN Red List changes. Specifically, the species or ecosystem is no longer globally threatened, And this can happen when the outcome of conservation action for a species or ecosystem has been a conservation success. Thirdly, more accurate information may be available about the trigger element, which leads to a revision of the range map such that it no longer meets the range, ecoregion, or bioregion restricted status, whichever applied in the past. And lastly, changes, in most cases, an increase in the global estimates of the assessment parameters of a species or ecosystem. So for example, range or number of mature individuals, resulting in a higher threshold, meaning that the site level estimate no longer meets that threshold. So therefore the site doesn't meet the criteria. In terms of a genuine decline, this may be due to inadequate management of threats at a site, and this refers to negative changes in the habitat caused by several different types of activities. These could be things like conversion to agriculture, impacts of invasive alien species, human disturbance, overfishing, overharvesting. There are many possible reasons. Genuine decline is further subdivided into either reversible within the short term or medium term, or irreversible in the short or medium term. So as the label will suggest, reversible activities are activities that can be managed so that the habitat can be restored within the short and medium terms. For example, through pastoral management or control and eradication of invasive alien species or sustainable harvesting programs. Irreversible activities are those that result from wholesale conversion of habitats, such as wetlands being drained to allow for urban and residential area development, or the global extinction of a trigger element. And the last reason is genuine change. So finally, genuine change beyond the site refers to situations where there has been a change in the proportion of the global population or extent of the trigger element at the site due to factors that are taking place elsewhere. This is particularly common for migratory species, for example. Just going back to what we were talking about in relation to genuine change. So previously confirmed KBAs that no longer meet criteria will no longer be treated as global KBAs. That's unless there is reasonable expectation that the site will requalify in the near future through proposed restoration activities. So if a site fails to meet KBA criteria for any biodiversity element, and the reason given is genuine decline reversible for one or more of the species, so that means that if the reduction could be reversed through proposed restoration activities, the site will be flagged as restoration dependent in the WDKBA to allow for restoration. So it will be still treated as a KBA, but there is a time window on it. So here, the KBA NCG or the KBA proposer should review the site status in 2 years. So you have 2 years basically to come up with a restoration plan and to begin implementing it. If restoration activities are not underway by the end of that 2-year period, then the site will be delisted. But if the restoration activities are underway and do not enable the site to recover its KBA status by the next reassessment, when the change in status will be reviewed and confirmed at the time. So basically that's saying that you need to get your restoration plan within 2 years, and if that's the case, then you have a further 8 years to carry out your restoration activities and hope that the trigger elements recover. And after that time, the site will be either confirmed as a KBA or delisted if the restoration activities fail. So just to recap on delisting a site, you as a proposer during the reassessment should provide as much detail as possible about each of the trigger elements. A couple of things to note, you do have to deselect qualifies before the other non-qualifying options. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the qualifies option, you need to deselect that before you can select the other options. If you are providing information about that trigger element, so for in this case a species, and you want to provide information about its site level estimates, provide those before you deselect it, because as soon as you provide a reason for non-qualification, that renders the rest of the species account as read-only and you won't be able to complete the details. So complete the details first and then deselect and select a reason for non-qualification. And finally, on the delisting, just to recap, it's you guys as the proposers and NCGs, you delist the trigger species or ecosystems, but not the sites. You provide the information. At the end of the process, the KBA Secretariat identifies that no triggers meet criteria and they delist the KBA. So any queries about delisting?
Yes, me, Carolina again. Just to be sure, in which box do we provide information for the reason of delisting the species?
So for delisting, we only at the moment have this pull-down menu. We don't have a text box for it, but if you want to provide further reasons why the species no longer qualifies or meets any of the criteria, please add it to the text box, the source, or not the source, there is an additional details box for species, further up the form. So if you add the information there, that would be perfect. Okay,
because in some cases we do have the updated estimates that are the like the reason for delisting, but if you need an additional reason, so maybe we use the box.
Yeah, use the box up further up the assessment form.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
We also have a question in the chat. Can a site be delisted if it is not reassessed within the 12 years?
Well, I think the way I'm interpreting this, so you're saying if the site hasn't been reassessed after 12 years, should we delist it? And if that's the question, the answer is no, because in many cases, we know that there will not be new information and people won't be able to, or they won't have the resources or whatever the reasons to reassess the site. So I wouldn't delist a site just because you don't have any information, but it depends on how old the information is.
And we have Paul. And there's a comment on our question in the chat box as well, but Paul first, and then we'll go to the chat question.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Olivia, for this presentation, and greetings from Kenya. We are currently reviewing the legacy KBAs, which were ideally IBAs, which now have moved to the KBA as legacy KBAs. Assessing them against the KBA criteria, because our assumption is some of them would definitely not meet the thresholds, for example, of the under the KBA criteria. So with those ones, you'd think they would be delisted but remain within the KBA platform, not appearing, as you have mentioned, not appearing to the public domain.
Yeah, Gachero, with the sites that with the former IBAs, so any IBAs that have been identified up to 2016, so up to when the KBA standard was published, are entitled to regional KBA status so long as they continue to meet IBA criteria. So great that you're reassessing the sites. Any of your sites that meet global KBA criteria will become global KBAs, will be global KBAs on the KBA website. And any that don't meet global KBAs criteria, but that do meet IBA criteria, should continue to be treated as legacy sites, and they'll be continue to be shown on the KBA website as regional KBAs. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and then I'll get to you, Brian. So we have a question from Catherine. I was wondering if you can go through the process of how to approach adding trigger species to a KBA which overlaps with others. Also, does this process change if they are legacy sites?
Okay, so you have a KBA that overlaps another one. So your first port of call then is consultation with the other proposer, the proposer of the other site, and you need to make a decision on what you do about your site. Do you, for example, is the overlap quite substantial such that it would make sense to increase the size of your site to include the other site? There are many other, or is it sufficient to find a common boundary and retain your site as you're proposing it? But either way, you need to resolve that through consultation. And we have further guidance on that, so come back to us if you have any queries about that process itself. Thereafter, if the boundary changes, then you need to reassess your triggers based on the new boundary. So if you're using range or AOH or ESH rather as an assessment parameter, then you would need to reassess based on the bigger boundary or the smaller boundary, whatever the case may be. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not quite sure. In terms of the legacy sites, yes, that would, they would also be affected, obviously, but that it would depend on the outcome of the consultation process. But it sounds complicated, and so do come back to us if we haven't quite addressed your question.
Sorry, I put it in the chat before, but I'll just carry on. Is it how do you find out who to contact for those sites? How do you find out who they are? Yeah, so I actually have a couple of slides on that, so I'll come back to that. Yeah. That's the next section, Catherine. Oh, sorry. No, not at all. Not at all. It's not at all intuitive, but it's something that we recognise, so I'll address it then. Great, thank you. No worries.
Brian?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Olivia, also for the presentation. Now, I'm just not sure if you can hear me clearly.
Yep. Yep.
Can you?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, then I'm sorry again for taking it back to superseding sites, where we had point number 3, where we can have 2 or more KBAs replaced by 2 or more other KBAs. So then my question would be, what is the geographical range of replacement? Or this can just happen, a KBA in a different location can replace another KBA in a totally different location?
It's more the case where you might have 2 adjoining KBAs, for example, and they were identified 20 years ago, and somebody's coming along with really good information about the species that were formerly assessed and new species and potentially ecosystems, and are providing evidence that 3 new KBAs would suit better, whether it be due to the distribution of the trigger elements, or whether it be due to manageability. But they may make that decision that creating 3 totally new KBAs out of 2 KBAs makes more sense. So I think we're thinking more along the lines of sites that are side by side, rather than sites that are quite far away from each other.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, if there are no further questions, I'll move on. You can come back to me again if we can. At the end of this presentation, I only have a couple more slides to go. We can cover any parts of the presentation. So moving on to a couple of additional things, I wanted to mention a couple of quirks relating to WDKBA, many of them resulting from the migration of data that we did at the beginning of when the WDKBA was launched. So some of these shortcomings include such as what to do when an assessment parameter is missing. So what do we mean by this? For some sites, so for example, the legacy sites, when they were migrated into WDKBA, there were several examples where we didn't know what the assessment parameter that was used to assess that trigger element. So they'll find that the assessment parameter will be null. So your first port of call then, in reassessing the site, will be to assign an assessment parameter. However, where there is no assessment parameter set, what the WDKBA does is it creates a duplicate panel. So you can see that by clicking on number of mature individuals here, I now have two panels with exactly the same information. But what you'll find is the top one is null and void. It's a read-only panel, and the bottom one is the one that you edit. So the process here will be to delete the top panel and then to provide your information in the bottom panel. Don't worry about deleting that top panel. It won't affect any previous assessments at the site, and just enter the information in the bottom panel where which is editable. A couple of other shortcomings, as Catherine mentioned, it's not possible at the moment in the WDKBA to know who the previous proposers were. We couldn't match up the proposers when we migrated the data across, mostly because not everybody, in fact, most people weren't registered on the site, so we didn't know who they were and we couldn't match them up. And we hope to reconcile this in due course. But if you need to know, if you're doing a reassessment and you need to know who previous proposers were, please contact me or the KBA Secretariat and we'll be able to dig them out. In many cases, they'll be BirdLife proposers, so I'll be able to help you out there, or I'll be able to track down who the previous proposers were. The other thing is that if you are reassessing a site that was previously proposed by someone else, be sure to review all of the site details, especially the text accounts. Some of these may have changed quite a bit since they were first put together, and especially if you're providing assessments based on other trigger elements. It's really important that you review all the text and make sure that you're happy with them, that they suit your reassessment. It's really important that you, where possible, bring in the previous proposer, so that they have a say in it, because they were, after all, they're the original owners of the site and they're the people who put it together in the first place. So we'll do our very best to help you track these people down if and when that happens. And then finally, when you're reassessing a site, you may find that several of the site detail fields in particular that are mandatory are actually missing. They haven't been completed. So you're going to need to complete these before you can actually propose the site. Again, ideally, this will be in consultation with the previous proposers, but if you can't reach them, please complete the details yourself and in accordance with the biodiversity elements that you're proposing the site for. So that is all that I have to say on that. I'll first of all take questions on those last few slides, and indeed any others if you have questions on any other parts of the presentation.
There aren't any questions in the chat that I can see.
Okay, and so I'll just finish by saying that there's a QR code in the top right-hand corner for feedback. Grateful for any feedback and how we can make these more useful to you guys. And we'll also post the link in the Zoom chat as well.
Yeah, I just posted the link to the feedback form in the chat.
Olivia, I have a question. I'm trying to raise my hand, but I can't see the function. So.
Okay.
Sure. Go for it, Joseph.
Yeah. My question is, it's with regards to the text. So I noticed that most of, for instance, for Ghana, most of the description, the site descriptions have changed. Especially previously we had just 10 regions. Now we have 16 regions. So the text descriptions for most of the sites have changed, and we're looking at, for a start, just updating the text descriptions for all the sites. But I notice once you start reassessment, you have to do add a lot of information before you'll be able to submit it. So how do we go about just changing the text before maybe doing a reassessment of all the other sites?
Yeah, so so when you do a reassessment of an existing site, that was kind of my last point there, that there will be many fields that are blank and that you will need to provide information in. So my advice to you would be to try and track down the previous proposer and to come up with text that you're happy with, make sure they're happy with, and to populate the site accounts with those. And then once, it's mostly the site details, but the other compulsory fields are in the about page relating to your consultation process also. But it's mostly those site details ones that are catching people out because they're reassessing a site and they're thinking that information should be there. So yeah, if you can track people down, the original proposers down, and again, we'll help you with that, and provide text accounts for each of the text boxes that are mandatory.
Thank you.
Just to make sure, are you then suggesting that first they propose the site updating all the compulsory fields in the site details and about page of the proposal, and once they've done that, then they start reassessing the trigger elements of the site?
Yeah, I think in this case, in the Ghanaian situation, if you're doing all sites, it might be more effective to get together with the previous proposer and just try and bottom that out, make sure that you don't have any blocks there, and you can just get all that information into the sites and then start adding the triggers. Or I guess so you have two options of doing it. You can do it outside the system, which might be a bit more convenient in some cases, or you can do it inside the system and maybe invite the Ghanaian, the previous proposer, as a co-proposer, so they're able to see what you're changing, or they're able to see what you're providing, and give you the nod on it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, so we have a recommendation, not a question, but a recommendation, that it might be a good idea to compile some before and after examples of KBA revisions corresponding to the cases presented, and then, yeah, provide them as guidance. Okay. We'll try to do that for the next version. Thank you for the feedback, Claudia. And I think Catherine actually does have a question. Catherine?
Hi, yeah. So just following on from that, at some point there was talk of adding in some, or providing some standardized text for some of these if we can't get hold of the previous people. I was just wondering if that was still a possibility, just to help. I know there is supposed to be some kind of standard of how you write, like justification text and things, and just having that somewhere. Just more examples of the kinds of things that you should be writing and what to write if you don't know too much. Be really useful.
I'm not aware. Is that in progress somewhere between yourselves?
Yes, so it's sort of in progress. For site details and a rationale, you probably would have to, well, you'd have to update it based on the information that you have access to. In terms of manageability and delineation rationale, if you, well, for manageability, ideally, there would be, as Olivia had mentioned previously, some consultations either with local stakeholders and or with previous proposers to understand their reasons for delineating the site in the way that they did. And hopefully that would also give you some insight into whether that site as it is would be a manageable unit. And related to that, in terms of delineation, if you can talk to them about why they delineated the site in the way that they did, then that would be great. You could basically just explain their reasoning. If that is not possible and you do not have access to any information about why they delineated or why that they chose, why they delineated the boundary in that way, then you could potentially write something along the lines of explaining the situation that you do not know the rationale for the delineation. You are updating the trigger element information on an existing KBA with an existing boundary. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other final questions? Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions, in which case we are now going to end the session. Thank you very much for your presentation, Olivia. It was very thorough. And thank you as well for everyone else who attended the session. I hope it was useful. And yeah, we look forward to receiving your proposals. Have a good evening.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Idie for providing the slides.
All right, I'm going to end the session now. Bye.
Thanks, Edie. Thanks, Olivia.
Bye guys.